Welcome to Tell the Damn Story, the show that explores the many ways to navigate the successes and failures that aspiring and struggling writers face to make your journey that much easier.
We're back and better than ever, ladies and gentlemen. It's Tell the Damn Story with me, Chris Ryan, emerging hybrid author, and Alex Simmons, aging legend. No. Alex has written everything from Batman to Scooby-Doo to Archie, and both Alex and I are really excited because we get to speak to a friend of the show and our friend Jim Beard. So, yay! Hello, yay! Alex. Hello, Jim. How we doing, everybody?
Hello out there in podcast land.
Sorry, I had
podcast land. A little elf dancing around. But yeah, so here we're back, as Chris said in the opening, we're back and it's great. And people know about Chris and people know about me, but I would like them to have a chance to learn a little bit about Jim Beard. That's the man. Yeah, actually, we all have beards. But anyway, Jim Beard, make up some stuff about yourself.
Everybody should know who I am. Why would I have to explain myself?
Right.
You know what? Add to the canon. Add to the canon.
Okay. I am a writer, editor, and self publisher of small press books. I have two publishing houses. I'm the founder of Becky Books, and I am the co-founder with my publishing partner John Bruning of Flinch Books. And John and I, are celebrating 10 years of Flinch Books.
Wow, how about that?
That's great. It's a banner year for us. We cannot wait to get to PulpFest this year to celebrate that. And we are hard at work on two new books for this year. The fourth volume of each of our signature characters. So I mean, I not only have my own properties that I do, but I also am known to do a licensed work now and then. I've done Star Wars and Ghostbusters comics. I've written official Green Hornet stories, Kolchak the Night Stalker, X-Files. I wrote a Spider-Man novel, and other things here and there. Captain Action.
How about that?
Who that is? So
yep.
I remember Captain Action.
I had the action figure.
Me too.
No dolls, not action.
No, I said action. No, they're action figures. They're absolutely action figures.
Actually, I think that Captain Action predates the term action figure.
No, G.I. Joe. They coined that for G.I. Joe.
Oh, okay. So I guess they
G.I. Joe predates Captain Action. In fact, Captain Action came into being as a direct competitor to G.I. Joe and was actually created by one of the creators of G.I. Joe.
G.I. Joe?
Yeah, he went off and
he was irate.
There's something you didn't know, folks. Right?
Yeah.
Wait a minute. Okay, so who came up with Johnny West?
You know, that I'm not sure. It's the Marx company, Louis Marx. I don't know if I've ever heard of the people behind the Johnny West series, but that was one hell of a that was a big series of
the horses and the West and John and
that was a lot. I had Johnny
West, right?
And his thick rubber vest.
Yeah, I had all that stuff and the chaps.
I'm looking at my wife's collection. She had Janie West, the daughter, Geronimo, Jane West, Princess Wildflower, and the bad guy, Sam Cobra.
Oh, I forgot about him.
And 4 of the horses.
Wow, that's amazing.
I only had one. No, actually I had 2 because Jane had a horse too. That's right.
That's cool.
But again,
now, ladies and gentlemen,
not dolls now they're action figures.
Ladies and gentlemen, all of this will make sense in a couple of minutes when we talk about the topic for today. But I just want to go back to Captain Action for a minute. The attraction with him, he eventually became his own hero. But when we were kids, you'd get Captain Action, and then you could get, I don't know how many different established superhero outfits that he could put on and become that hero.
That's right.
There's about a dozen.
About a dozen?
all in the classic era. Yeah, and I hate to say it, I should know the exact number, but it's about a dozen. There was a bunch of DC characters, some Marvel
Right.
characters.
And the Lone Ranger.
Right, and then yeah, and then strangely enough, there were these other there was Green Hornet and there was Lone
Right.
Ranger, but there was also um Steve Canyon from the newspaper strips.
Yeah,
There was
sure.
Buck Rogers. It was
Right.
this strange conglomeration, but it was unprecedented because all of those licenses were mixed in one property with one property under
Yeah,
one.
I'm not sure how he pulled that off, but it was pretty
It
interesting.
was a day when that could happen,
Right. That could never
it
happen
would be
now, but
hard to have that happen
yeah,
today, yeah.
but it was pretty fun.
Yeah.
And that shows everybody the kind of mind and memory that Jim and Alex have for all these things.
I bet you're going to say
Um,
it shows how old we are.
well, I mean, how do you say it without saying it?
I know.
So,
Just go ahead and say it, Chris.
Actually, I'm sorry. I'm looking, because I went online. What the heck? I'm looking here, and it says the original line had 9 costumes.
Nine.
And you're
Okay.
right. It's Superman, Batman, Aquaman from DC, then
right,
Captain America from Marvel, then Flash
Spider-Man.
Gordon, the
Mhm.
Phantom,
The
Steve
Phantom, that was the
Canyon,
other one.
yeah,
Yeah.
Steve Canyon, the Lone Ranger, and then Sergeant Fury.
Yep.
Wow. How about that?
Then
So
they
there you
started
go,
coming
ladies
up
and
with all the
gents.
other things like the
Yeah.
Green Hornet, Spider-Man, Buck Rogers, you
And
know,
then there was his sidekick, Action Boy, and
Action
Action
Lad.
Boy had
Wasn't it Action
three.
Lad?
It was Action Boy,
Oh,
and
okay.
he had three DC characters he could change into: Robin,
But
Superboy, and Aqualad.
Uncle Lad, yeah.
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 Um, and then Dr. Evil was the bad guy, but he didn't he had a generic human scientist he could turn into, but he didn't have any licensed characters that
Right.
back in the day that he could turn into.
Sure.
And we've
So,
gone down that rabbit hole.
well, what that shows, ladies and gentlemen, is that these gentlemen are well prepared for today's topic. Now, we talk a lot about horror, we talk a lot about action, but there's really another genre, a really interesting genre that both is very historical, but with people like Jim, is also going through a little bit of a rebirth. And what we're talking about is the genre of pulp. And I was hoping we could talk about that, talk a little bit about the history of it, what pulp is, and then we can talk about writing established characters, coming up your own characters. What does the style of pulp require? Stuff like that. And that's why we had to call in Jim Beard, because Jim Beard knows all these answers.
Jim Beard knows pulp.
Oh,
Yes.
or it's going to be a very boring show, right?
There you go. So, Jim, you've done both licensed pulpish characters, if not pure pulp characters, and you've also done your own. So, if you don't mind, I'm going to put you on the spot
Okay,
and
that's what I'm
ask
here for.
you to define what pulp was
Uh-huh.
and then what pulp is considered today.
Ooh, you don't ask easy ones.
No, we're just going to go right to the essay question.
Well, you know what John Bruning and I kind of like to say is that pulp is, you can ask 10 different pulp writers what
Mhm.
pulp is, and you're
Yep.
going to get 20 different answers.
Oh,
Not
definitely,
more than
definitely.
that. So in a classic sense, the pulp style came out of the pulp magazines, and that's generally considered the 30s up into the 50s.
Right.
And that all was born from the dime novels from
Right.
even earlier
From
on,
even
and then
earlier than
kind of
that, sure.
morphed into the and it was basically a very, very inexpensive way to get regular fiction out to the masses.
Right. So the name
Could we
came
say
from the
that
kind of
just
paper they used.
Yeah,
just to
that
give the lay people a personal reference, could we say that pulps were like the great grandparents of paperback novels?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
In fact,
definitely.
the
Yeah.
paperback novels kicked off, in earnest in the 50s and then going into the 60s,
Right,
and they were greatly benefited by the pulp magazines because there was a lot of reprints.
right.
To get a lot of product out, those
Hmm.
early paperback publishers were taking pulp, stories from decades earlier and
Just sticking
reprinting
it in.
them
Yeah,
and sometimes almost passing them off as new
right.
stuff. Yeah.
Now, the style
Hmm.
of pulp storytelling,
Yeah.
I mean, part of it came from deadline oriented. They were doing like novel length stories.
Yeah.
How
Well,
often? Were they coming out monthly?
Yes, yeah, very much so. If I'm not mistaken, at at one point the Shadow was maybe twice monthly.
Oh,
They they
God bless
they
them. God
ramped it
bless them.
up. Like the
Yeah,
ones that got really popular, they really, ramped them up. But yeah, they number one, they're brief. They're, pulp novels, pulp stories are get in, tell the damn story
yes.
and get out. I mean, you guys couldn't have picked a better, title for your podcast because in a nutshell, that's what it is.
Yeah,
Tell the damn story. Pulp is said to be story driven,
right,
not necessarily character driven.
right,
The weight and the importance is placed on the story, and the characters, although they can be interesting characters,
right,
they do not necessarily evolve.
right. I mean, if
And
you, if
or didn't back in the day. They somebody like Doc Savage, the publishers had to ensure that every month that they pick up that Doc Savage magazine,
right,
that the character was going to be the exact same character
right,
month after month after month. Because if a reader skipped a month, they wanted it to be the same 3 months down the road,
right,
and
and you could jump on at
you
any
could,
point.
yeah, you're right.
Right,
Very rarely did they refer back to, or in the early Doc Savage novels, they did actually have a lead in at the very end of the novel. It'd say, you know, um, Doc solved that one, but little did he know that right around the corner he'd be plunged into, the polar
land of
mystery,
fear.
and then there probably was a
Yeah,
blurb for it, and then you'd come back next month, for the
right.
polar mystery or the.
But what you would get somewhere in the first chapter or two, and it was usually when Doc was working out, for example, and you'd
Yeah.
get a little bit of backstory about him,
Yeah, they all
usually
they
paragraph or two, and that would
w-
be
w-
all you would get, and the
yeah.
rest was forward moving
I
story.
got to credit Lester Dent, who is the co-creator of Doc Savage and wrote the bulk of
Sure, sure.
the 181
Right,
original adventures, if I'm not mistaken. That he would do that. He'd have that little paragraph then tell you who Doc was, but it wasn't the exact same wording every time. I mean, it was so funny. Like he varied it a little
a little
bit,
bit, just a little bit,
I
just a
mean,
little
just
bit.
so nobody could ever accuse him of what we call cut and pasting,
Yeah.
Right,
today. But I always like to call pulp machine gun style. And
sure,
that's very appropriate because the pulps were excessively bloody, most times, and
sure.
violent and really an homage to guns.
Oh
But
yeah, yeah,
but it's got to be that rat tat 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 tat, and
sure.
then chapter end, and however that chapter ends, it's gotta drag the person to the next chapter.
Right. It was page
It's gotta,
turner. You would end the chapter on a page turner, cliffhanger, surprise,
always. And
always. Right.
again, it's story driven.
Yeah.
The story is everything. And that doesn't mean the character's not interesting, but they're always going to emphasize that they actually had rules about we don't want continued stories.
Right. Right.
Mm.
No.
That they did not want the writers to do that, so that you didn't have to worry if you missed an issue. it sold out at the newsstand or
Right,
or
right.
anything like that at all. There were some rare occasions of that. The character called Operator, oh my God, Operator,
Oh yeah, 90 something was it?
no, 13, what, Operator 5. Woo!
Operator 5.
Operator 5. There was in the middle of his run of the magazine, they had God, it was like 14 parts
Oh,
called the Purple Invasions, and it's considered, the great saga of the pulp days.
right, right.
And that was, although it was individual stories, it was one big overarching story where a very thinly veiled Germany invaded the United States in the 30s,
Wow.
before World War II, or before we got into World War II. And this was the whole story about how, Operator 5 and his band, his merry band, raised a rebellion and fought back, and then finally got rid of the invaders. Another rare thing is the Spider actually married his girlfriend, which is just
Which,
unheard of, back in those days.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Like that would be like, Lamont Cranston marrying Margot Lane, I mean,
Un,
no, he'd sleep with her, but he's not
unthinkable.
married
Yeah,
her.
but no, but
Unthinkable.
actually, I don't know about the novels, but in the radio show, Margot, in the early days of the radio show, Margot would talk about Lamont as if he's her fiance, or he's definitely the love of her life. They're mutually
Yeah.
committed to one another. But then as things progress, and we're still talking about the 40s, they started playing her more like his friend and his buddy,
They
and she
might have
was
gotten a
always the
little,
always the bait for the bad guys.
they might have gotten some feedback or, gun shy. That's a good point to make, is that the Shadow radio drama hardly resembles the pulp novels.
Right.
Yeah.
They really, changed a lot. That's where that whole thing about clouding men's minds
Yep.
came about.
Came from the
There's
radio.
not anything like that
You
in
don't see that in the
pulp
pulps. Yeah.
novels.
Yeah.
He doesn't turn invisible or anything like that
Oh,
at
he's a
all.
ninja.
It's a very different
Yeah,
character.
he's very
And
much
a
more like
lot
a
of
ninja.
shooting.
Yes.
Yeah, and that's true, because in the radio drama there's not. But yeah, no, he's gun happy in the actual
Oh,
pulp
yeah.
Twin
novels.
45s. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But so
I mean,
in a nutshell, that's what pulp was. It was
right.
monthly fiction for a dime. Somebody in the Depression could afford that.
Right.
And they got, I don't know how many hours of entertainment out of that
Sure.
before the
It
days
was
of
great.
television, when we had was the radio and maybe a stage play,
Yeah.
some vaudeville or whatever. That was entertainment.
And
And
they
and
could
That,
carry it around
you
with them.
you
They
got a
could.
full novel, and you got a couple of short
yeah.
stories,
Right.
you've got an editorial,
So
it was,
I'll tell you a quick anecdote about pulps. Um, in the 70s, uh, you could get the Bantam reprints
yes.
of The Shadow. So I read everything. So I grabbed one. I think it was actually The Living Shadow.
Hmm.
And I'm walking around. My old man always walked around with a book in his hand, right? So I'm walking
Yeah.
around with this book in my hand, and he sees me reading it. And for the first time in my life, he goes, "Hey, when you finish with that, give it to me. I want to read it." And I was like, "Why?" He said, "I read those when I was a kid."
Yeah.
So, when he was older and his health was failing, I was at one of these cons. It might have been a Pulp Fest, actually. And I picked up one of the 1930s or early 40s original pulps, and I
The
gave it
actual
to him, and
magazine.
he
Yeah.
just couldn't get over it. It was
Yeah.
like, yes. So it was a little bonding experience.
If,
I
if
want to start talking about I want to talk about the writing of the original pulps to use it as a bridge to writing new pulp. So
Yeah.
Lester Dent, since we mentioned Lester Dent, co-creator Doc Savage, he used to say, and I'm really loosely paraphrasing, so Jim, fix it if I miss it, right? So he'd
Okay.
say, here's the blueprint for stories. You introduce the characters, get them in a jam, have a fight, get them out, get them in worse trouble, and then get them in some more trouble, and then it's a big fight, and they wrap it up, and you're done. Something like that.
It's very formulaic, you
Yeah,
know,
yeah.
but people loved it. Later on, as Doc Savage gets close to the end of the run of the original magazine, they changed things up somewhat, because after World War II, they decided that people did not want a Superman
Right.
of a character, and they started to ground him. You know, everybody had seen the horrors of the war, and a regime that, you know, was dedicated to creating a Superman, as it
Superman, yeah.
were. And that was just, you know, too much. And it's unfortunate because the later Doc Savage novels are, like, Doc is very human. You know,
Yeah.
he goes out with women. You know, he feels fear. In the very final novel, he screams in terror at something, and
Wow.
they're kind of hard to read. And they did the same thing with the Shadow at the very end. He was just Lamont Cranston, and like, you know, a detective, you know, like a
He
private
was a
detective.
shadow of his former self.
He was a shadow of his former self. And folks, we are done. And thanks for
Thank you
joining
very
us
much.
today.
Thanks for stopping by.
There's no topping that. Chris gets it. All right, yeah.
That was so terrible. But
But yeah, it was very formulaic, but that's what people, you know, really wanted. They wanted that comfortable feeling of picking up any pulp magazine
right.
and knowing what they were going to get. Now,
And
you called pulp a genre, and I don't want to, like, correct you with a hammer,
no,
but
more or less was a format, though,
technically,
right?
if it's a genre, it's the genre that encompasses all other genres,
Okay.
because
Yeah.
there is pulp horror, pulp
Right.
mystery,
Right.
pulp science fiction, pulp romance, and pulp fantasy, and
Old
so on and so on
sci-fi.
and so
Yeah.
forth.
Yeah.
It's the thing that I really love about pulp is that you can take almost any other genre and
And fold
adapt
it in.
it with the pulp
Right.
style. Some people like to call it a style more than a genre.
Well, that
Just
I
kind
think
of
that's
throwing that
fair.
out.
I think that's fair. So let's talk about the style. Um, Short, uh, tight
Punchy.
sentences, quick
Punchy.
paragraphs.
Yeah.
Um, how's the balance between narrative and dialogue? What would you say to all that?
Like what you would expect. It's a good balance between the two. It's not a lot of there's not a lot of, like you said, it's short paragraphs. There's not a lot of, you know, exposition about things. It's, you know, quick descriptions, but setting a mood and a tone. But
Right.
there's very little poetry in it.
Right.
Mm.
Charles
You know,
Dickens would
because
not be a pulp writer.
yeah, no character in Pulp stops and ponders the meaning of life.
Right.
It's not about that. It's that masked villain has a dirigible that he is raining down these, like, bolts of electricity on the skyscrapers, and they're crumbling and falling down on the people. We've got to get up there and stop
Stop
him.
that.
Yeah. Yeah, please stop that. And
You
in the
gotta stop it.
process, we're going to get captured. We're going to escape, you know, and then we're going to travel across the globe
Right.
to a small, previously unknown Asian country,
Oh,
you know, and maybe rope in a few of the natives there to help us defeat this guy. And in the
Right.
end, we're going to set it up where the guy defeats himself.
There
That's
you go.
the the Shadow was more like, no, I'm just going to shoot this guy.
Right. Right.
But Doc Savage, his bad guys almost always did themselves in. So
Right.
Doc could walk away with a clean conscience. He had a
Right.
code against killing. The
Right.
Shadow had a code to kill.
yeah.
Yes.
You know?
He was the
But
He was
original
Doc,
the
James
Doc,
original
Bond.
license
you
to
know,
kill, right?
He was the original James Bond. Yeah.
yeah, Doc was the kind of guy who would watch as, you know, the bad guy fell into his own, you know, pit with tigers in it or
Right.
something, and then
Oh,
he'd say, you
damn.
know, he'd do a Batman in Batman's very first story, a fitting end for his kind,
Yes.
Well,
you know,
actually, what was it? What was
and then
Christian
take his
Bale's
five,
line?
you know, partners and walk away.
What was Christian Bale's line in his first Batman movie? I'm
I
not
don't have,
kill you, but I don't
I
have to
won't
save
kill
you.
you, but I don't have to save you. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right, yeah.
Right. That kind of deal.
It's kind of, something like that. But yeah, it's a pretty good balance between narrative and dialogue. And I think today, at least for me, when you read those old novels, I love the dialogue because it's not somebody trying to write like somebody from the 1930s is talking. It was written back then. So
Right.
it's maybe it's a little over the top, but you're going to get dialect and you're going to get so much slang that's,
Oh yeah.
archaic now. You're going to get really weird spellings of words like clue, CLUE is almost always CLEW.
Right.
You're going to get words that were hyphenated back then but are not today.
Right.
The,
I remember.
a,
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
pulp story from the 30s or the 40s is an instant time machine.
Oh
Mm.
yeah.
And yes, you're going to get a lot of stuff that would not pass muster today.
Yes. Yes.
And you
And
have to know that going into it and realize that you're reading something that was written for those people of that time.
right.
And that's the cool thing about writing pulp today is that we can still write in that style. We can do all those things, but we can we can correct that those problems
Those problems.
today.
And
And
by
of
the way,
course,
Jim Beard, winner of the segue of the day. But
I'll be here all week. Thank
there you
you.
go. So
Just you wait.
let's talk about modern or what do we call it? Do we call it new pulp? Do we call it modern
Well,
pulp?
yeah,
What,
ask 10 pulp writers and you'll get 50 answers. Yeah.
Oh,
Um,
oh, we're going up some now. Okay.
yeah, yeah. That's the beauty of my tribe.
oh yeah.
Um, it has been called new pulp for quite a while right now. John and I like to just refer to it as pulp, you
Yeah.
know. And when that kind of fails to connect with people, I've also used the term adventure fiction.
Okay.
My
Adventure
my
fiction.
banner at
Cool.
shows actually says my name and then it says writer of adventure fiction. It's a crutch. It's kind of like an easier way to get the idea across to people because the word pulp is slipping away. If it's not slipped away altogether,
Yeah.
to the person on the street would have no idea other than pulp
Right.
and orange juice.
Well,
Right.
and whether we love it or not, it is kind of chained to the 30s and 40s. If you go to Pulp Fest, there's so much classic old stuff on sale
Hmm.
that feels like it makes up a good part of that
It,
event.
it
But
not to be
people like
argumentative.
you
It
are
is and
giving
it
it new
isn't.
life.
Hmm. It is and it isn't chained to
Okay,
that. It again, it depends on who you talk to or who the writer is working today.
right.
And Chris, you had given me an idea of what we are going to talk about tonight, and I started thinking about
Damn
that
it.
a lot. And that's what pulp the pulp publishing business is today. There's a certain amount of people who are literally writing 30s and 40s pulp novels and stories without the racism, without the
Some,
sexism and that.
Hmm.
Then you have the people who are saying, I love the style, but I want to see what we can do with it today by maybe merging it with things that you wouldn't have found back then. And
right,
that's me.
right,
I started out wanting to write pulp novels that felt as much as possible, as close as I could get to something from the 30s and 40s, because, I cut my teeth on reading Doc Savage novels
right, right.
and spider novels and shadow novels. And I thought that's what it was. I got into writing pulp and I said, well, I have to emulate Lester Dent, which is not a bad thing
No, that's not bad.
to do. But a lot of my early stuff I mean, I wrote in that same, exact style. Short sentences, and get to the point, and a lot of action verbs.
Right. Sure. Um, how about now? How have you evolved in your pulp writing?
So after doing that, I said, well, what if we do this? And what if we do that? Because my interests were starting to broaden. And I said, well, I'd really like to, try this. I always want to be a pulp writer because I found out that that's what I could do. I couldn't write like slice of life novels if, it just, you know,
You wouldn't have
I
written Ma Perkins, huh?
Right. Exact. I'm not gonna. I can't. I'm not Sidney Sheldon or
Right,
whatever the
right.
heck else. But um, I wanted to see how I could take that fun style of writing, that fun, adventurous style of writing, but have it be adapted or pressed into a 1960s pop band that was like the
I
Beatles.
rem
Mm.
I mean, I
What's the
wanted
name
to
of that
do,
book? I've
I
seen that
wanted to
book.
take my interests here and then, slam it together
Right.
Hmm.
with pulp. And no approach is wrong. There's a market today for emulating the 30s and 40s style, and having and setting it, keep it in that era. The
Mhm.
stories are actually set in the 30s and 40s, usually with a central hero who, if people like Indiana Jones, then you're gonna like, this
Right.
character.
Hmm.
Right off the
Well,
top of my head,
Alex's blackjack character is set in the 30s. Yeah. Boom.
boom, good one.
Boom. Yeah, right.
I,
But these days it's not limited to the 30s.
no,
You've
no,
done stuff that's very
you can
modern.
set it, whenever you want. I mean, look at Conan.
Right.
Conan is a pulp character. Conan came out of the pulp magazines.
Hmm.
I don't know exactly when the Hyborian age is, but it's not in the 30s and 40s that I'm aware of. But, Robert Howard was a pulp writer.
Oh yeah.
Conan Doyle was a pulp writer. He wasn't writing
True.
for the highbrow, high society. He was writing for the masses. Now,
What was the
let me.
pulp character? What was the pulp character Solomon?
Solomon Kane, that was Robert E.
Solomon
Howard
Kane.
Solomon
as
King.
well.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
Yeah.
him too. Let me throw this one out to you. Shakespeare was a pulp writer.
Well, then you could
Of
say
his
about
time. Yeah.
Alexander Dumas.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would agree with both of them because you're writing for mass consumption.
You're writing for mass consumption and mass entertainment.
And
right,
in
right.
installments.
For the groundlings in Shakespeare's case, because they filled up much more of the audience than the royals upstairs.
Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
I mean, that's
so yeah,
why he became who he was because he was able to, appeal to the masses with
yeah.
so much of his work. So,
I I used to when I was teaching Shakespeare to high school students, they would be like, "Why is it like this?" I was like, "This was equal to your favorite television show
yeah,
back then. No
yeah,
one struggled with the way it's written now. That's just because times have changed." But
I've likened some of Shakespeare's stuff to because when we say, well, why does it have to be written like that? Why does he have to use that funny language? I said, well, I mean, why do your rappers write the way they do?
yeah,
yeah,
good
yeah,
point.
And they look at me and they go, yeah, I'm sorry. Some of that jargon does not resonate with me because that's not the life I'm in or that's not the entertainment I follow absolutely.
right.
But when I check it out, I have to have a thesaurus next to me, a rapper's thesaurus, in order to follow it.
Urban Dictionary.
Yeah,
Yeah,
there you go.
yeah.
Yeah.
That said, that doesn't mean that the pulp writers of the 30s and 40s didn't have a nice turn of phrase now and
Oh
then.
yeah,
And in fact, that's how I work is I don't worry about doing that, but occasionally one will pop out and suddenly be there and I'll step back and go, "Oh, Well, I kind of like that phrase, you know, like that's a little poetic. And if that happens, then you know what? So much the better. Kind of to me, it
Fantastic.
kind of adds to the whole thing. But I'm never going to do that in you know and have it interfere with the story. But
Right.
if it happens, it happens because it happened to Lester Dent and Walter Gibson and Hugh B. Cave and all those guys back then. You
Let
know,
me
and
let me ask
stumbling upon them now is really cool. You know.
Oh,
let,
yeah.
let me ask you this. Since we're like Chris did with horror, and he came up with the term hybrid horror to sort of help demonstrate the wide berth of possibilities one could do with horror. And we're
Yeah.
talking about pulp, and now we've included Shakespeare and Alexander Dumas. So would you say that one of the things that pulp was printed on a very consistent, either monthly or bi-monthly basis? Like it wasn't like you had to wait a year for the next book or 2 years or anything like that, that you,
Correct.
you had a consistent flow of material. So then would we say, here we go, folks, would we say that Franklin W. Dixon, Laura Lee Hope, and Carolyn Keene could have been also considered as pulp writers for the younger audience?
Very much so. And
Yeah.
I'm really glad that you brought that up because now, obviously, the Nancy Drew and the Hardy Boys started in the, did they
20s.
start in the 20s or
Yeah,
30s?
late 20s,
Late
Yeah.
20s or whatever.
1927, something like
So
that.
they're running concurrently
Right.
with Pulp, you know. But yes, it's very much so. You could look at that as Pulp for children, you
Hmm.
know,
Yeah. Yeah.
which is what some people are doing today. The cool thing is that Pulp has never died. It's just got a different face on it. And people are sometimes surprised when we bring that up. And I'll go, look at Clive Cussler.
Right.
Clive Cussler was just a pulp writer.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he just happened to be getting his stuff printed in books, and which came out, I don't know, a couple times a year, once a year, whatever, you know, whatever it is. Um, um, Harlequin and Silhouette romance novels
Right.
are just the pulp romance
Yep.
Oh,
magazines of the day.
definitely.
It's exactly the same. They come out every month.
Right.
It's a short story. You know exactly what you're getting, and it's formulaic.
Yep.
You know,
Yeah.
it has a lot more sex than there ever was
Yeah,
back in
Frank
the
and Joe
day.
weren't, no, they weren't enjoying
But
that.
it's all still here. It's just it had to adapt to be
Right.
able to survive.
But let me also point out another aspect of that, which is whereas Lester Dent and Maxwell Grant and some of these other writers of pulp for adults were writing those series, like, who wrote The Spider?
Oh
Fine,
my
we'll come
God,
back to that. But anyway, these
I
guys were writing their
I know
series.
that.
The Laurel E. Hope, the Carolyn Keene, and Franklin W. Dixon were pen names
Right.
for literally a stable of writers
Yes,
who
yep.
were turning out these stories for the Hardy Boys, Nancy Drew, the Bobbsey twins, and so forth. These were all different writers writing under three specific pen names.
Yeah.
And those writers could never admit that they wrote the Hardy Boys
The
That's
or
true.
Nancy Drew.
The
Yes.
lady that wrote the first several Nancy Drew books lived and worked in my hometown. In fact, she was here, if I understand this correctly, when she wrote those novels,
That's
and
great.
Wow.
you know, here in my town, we're you know very proud of her, and she's gone now, but much you know later
Are
on
you
when
sure?
she was able to be identified, you
Right.
know, as that you know, and so there's some pulp legacy going on, and it's in the water, you know, in my
Yeah.
hometown.
That's beautiful.
Um,
Now,
but it's everywhere. It's just that some people don't realize it. They could be
right.
reading it and not realize all they're doing is reading the people who continued on from the early days.
Hmm.
Right. I mean, you could point to someone like James Patterson as a modern pulp writer because
Oh,
he just churns
very
it
much
out, that
so.
kind of
Yeah,
stuff.
thank you. He's definitely you know, I'm trying to think.
Pulp-ish.
Um
Pulp
Alistair
light.
MacLean, you know?
Yeah,
Yeah,
sure. Read him I used to take my father's books and read
yeah.
him. Yeah.
Um,
What do you think?
People could argue that Ian Fleming,
That's right.
I don't know why that went out.
We're building some suspense, ladies
Jim,
and
are you
gentlemen.
there? Jim?
Will
Yeah,
we
I'm
get Jim
here.
Beard back?
I don't know why it lost oh shoot, it lost the camera. Guys, I don't know why it's not allowing me to do it, but you can hear me.
Yes, we
Ladies and
can.
gentlemen,
Okay, we may have to, I'll try to keep fiddling with it, but for some
uh,
reason, I don't know. I'm
Well,
gonna,
ladies and
we can
gentlemen,
pause.
welcome
Yes,
to a modern pulp.
I know, right?
It's
yeah,
called Attack of the Face Stealer.
yes.
Nobody wants to really like look at my face anyway.
It's the Jim Beard radio show right here on
But
the damn story.
oh,
There he
he's
is.
back.
All right
He's
then.
back. Da, da, da,
Jim,
da, 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 da,
one
da,
of the
da.
things that people who want to be snobby knock pulp for is the purple prose. And you
Yeah.
do see some of that, but modern pulp, well, it depends on, if there's a lot of self-published that is more purpley than, your level or whatever. So let's talk about purple prose and how to avoid it.
Oh,
What does that mean even?
I'm not necessarily avoiding it.
Well, let's explain what purple prose is.
Yeah, well, you start, Chris.
Well, some of the ham-handed turns of phrase, some of the overuse of alliteration, maybe hyperbole can be
You
seen
just
as.
described all of my writing.
No, I don't think so. I disagree. I've read a lot of your stuff.
I went to the Stanley School of Alliteration, so
Yeah.
I admit it. I have a lot of alliteration, and because I love it, and I use it in everything. If I can figure that, especially in my like nonfiction articles and essays and things.
Right,
But
but
yeah,
you
it's
wouldn't do five words that start with the letter P in a row. I mean, that's when it starts getting really purpley.
says you, buddy. Another way of describing it is overheated.
Yeah, a little overheated.
Deathless bros.
Can we
Yeah.
give examples?
Well, I mean, you mentioned Stan Lee, and although he was comics, the Fantastic Four, every sentence ending with an exclamation point, kind of purpley,
Yeah, definitely. I mean, people kind of maybe joke about like crime fiction back in the day, she walked into my office, she was a long drink of water that I wanted
with
to
legs
give
from
her,
here to
Get a happy
Mississippi
straw.
and back.
refilling, or that kind. That's like what we're talking about.
Right,
I mean, today that would be considered silly
right,
and it would be considered cliched.
Hmm.
right.
But back
But
in the day, that was exciting and charged,
right,
and especially men, probably just ate that stuff up. That's why it was created,
sure.
you know.
But I would argue that part of the evolution of style is because the field of entertainment has gotten much more crowded than back in the 30s, where you would go to radio or maybe the newspaper, the funnies or pulp novels for your entertainment. But now, there's 400 channels, there's
Yeah.
films, there's, audiobooks, a million new books a day coming out on Amazon.
Here's an interesting thought. Pulp could serve an important purpose today because it's short.
Yep.
It's get in, tell the damn story, get out.
Right.
With people's attention spans today,
Right.
you would think that a pulp way of writing would be attractive because it's not lengthy. You don't have to think that hard, and it's going to stimulate a certain part of your brain for a little while, and then it's over. And then you go on to the next one. But the problem is that reading has a stigma
Right.
today, and
Well,
that's unfortunate.
except for readers. right? That audience
Yeah.
is insatiable. But I've been experimenting with it. As you can see, this is really ridiculously short. It's more of a novelette than a novel.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and we'll see how it works, you know.
Yeah. Charles
Again,
Millhouse with Stormgate Press is doing a lot of that. He's coming out with a lot of these short bursts. Tommy Hancock with Prose used to have shoot, he used to have uh I can't think of the name of the series, but it was just little short ones like that.
right.
It was almost like getting a short story, but by
Mhm.
itself in a package. Um, um, you could also say that their pulp is in movies and television.
Yeah.
I think, as we all know, Star Wars is pulp.
Oh, definitely.
You
Definitely.
know,
So is
Star
Indy
Trek is not
Star
until you get to the point where it goes off the rails and it doesn't feel like Star Trek anymore, and it's just cowboys in space and stuff like that. But Star Wars is very much, Star Wars came from space opera, and space
right.
opera came from the pulps.
Sure.
You know,
My wife and I recently went through the whole run of Star Trek Discovery, and that came across more sci-fi than pulp
hmm
because they were always stopping to have the big discussion,
yeah,
the
yeah,
big idea,
yeah.
as
Well,
opposed to, running in with tricorder and phaser.
a lot of the writers that we hold up today as science fiction legends of who wrote true science fiction, speculative fiction,
Right.
came out of the pulps. Ray
Sure.
Bradbury would not
Yeah,
have been
definitely.
Ray Bradbury if he had not started in the pulps.
Oh
He's a
yeah,
great example. So many of those guys from his era, they got all of their experience from working in the pulps. Mickey Spillane
sure.
and whoever else they all Max Brand,
Sure.
it's so funny. Max Brand is thought of as a Western writer, but he's the creator of Dr. Kildare.
Oh,
Wow, how about
Yeah,
that?
yeah. Um, so the long and short of it is
Louis
it's
Larimore.
everywhere.
It's everywhere, yeah.
Would you say
Yeah.
Larimore is a pulp writer or was influenced
Louis
by
L'Amour,
pulp?
yeah.
Oh
Yeah.
God, yes.
Yeah, definitely,
Yeah,
definitely.
very, very much. Is Zane Grey?
Oh
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah, those guys are all pulp writers, were pulp writers, whatever you want to say.
So
Definitely, definitely.
so Jim, many of the people who watch this show are aspiring or emerging writers. If they were
Don't
intrigued
do
by
it.
this,
Don't do it.
if they were somehow intrigued with this episode where we went wildly back and everywhere else, and they wanted to give pulp a try,
Mm.
I have two sets of questions. The first question is, what would you recommend they read as examples of modern pulp? And then the second one, where do they where do they go to get published? What are there magazines? Are there outlets? That kind of stuff. So what
Yeah.
would you think would be modern examples for people to get a feel for?
Well, I don't know if you set me up for this, but
Of course
my
I did.
stuff, So my one company, Flinch Books,
Sure.
we put out pulp books, you
Yeah.
know.
In a
Um
lot of different genres.
in a lot
I
of different genres,
Yeah.
and in some ways showing that it can be part of any genre.
Right.
Um, but everybody that we work with is a pulp writer,
Ooh, I
you
feel good
know,
about that.
and but we're saying like, okay, we did a Western anthology that we're very proud of, and I think
Yes.
it's very pulpy, and it happened to have this guy named Ryan who made his Western
Western
debut.
Western debut, baby.
Yeah, and this guy too made his Western
Oh
debut
yeah.
in that one. But then we also have a character set in the 1970s who is an analog to Eric von Daniken, the
And which
Chariots of the
title would
Gods
that be?
the guy.
In
It's Conrad von Honig, you know. there's a lot of it out there, but it's not going to be necessarily in your Barnes and Noble.
Right.
And it's not always going to, even online, it's not always going to be labeled, as pulp.
Pulp, right.
But you can, look up like companies, Flinch Books, which is me, Prose, Pro, and then
Right.
SE,
Dash
Prose.
SE, yeah.
Airship 27, where I got my
Sure.
start.
Sure.
Stormgate Press, which is Charles Millhouse. These are some really good places to start. Charles may be a really good place to start because he has a character that has a huge long series of books, Captain Hawkland, which
Mhm.
Captain Hawkland is so pulp, it's not funny. I mean, Charles has deeply rooted that character
Into
in
pulp.
the tradition of the aviator, two-fisted, you know, pre-World War II into World War II itself era, of characters. I mean, if you want to get a picture of that, and then there are so many reprints today. When I was really getting into it, and Chris, you mentioned it, in the 60s and 70s, they were starting to mine the pulp magazines to reprint in paperback, and they
Right.
were doing all the Bantam was doing Doc Savage, Signet, and whoever else was doing the Shadow. And then you'd get little oddball things here and there. And when I first started to get into it in the 80s and even kind of into the 90s, it was hard to find those because they
Right.
were from the 60s and 70s. And the prices were kind of starting to go up on them. And aside from the Shadow and Doc Savage, maybe the print runs weren't as big as those. So
Right.
but now it's so funny. They have reprinted more pulp than they haven't. All
Right.
because a lot of it's in the public domain,
Sure.
you know.
I
Um,
know a
uh,
couple of guys who that's their entire company is
yeah,
reprinting, you know.
Steger Press
Yeah.
is you know they don't go a month without coming out with the collected adventures of this character,
Right.
or Tales from Black Mass magazine, and
Right.
and it's everything, crime and aviation,
Yeah.
war pulp, horror pulp. It's all out there, and it's kind of easy to get. You
To
just give it
grab. Yeah.
a
There was the
little
big,
Googling.
big book of pulp crime, big book of black mask stories, of locked
That's a
room
good point.
mysteries.
Yeah,
Yeah.
is maybe find one of those chunky
Yeah. Big chunks. Yeah.
collections, and you don't have to necessarily read full novels, which
Right.
a pulp novel back in the day was only about 60,000 words, and that's what
Right.
I still hold that standard today. I
Mm.
I
I
remember it
call a
like
novel
181
60,000 words.
pages would be a Doc Savage novel. Yeah,
Yeah.
something like that.
Yeah. But
But
you can do some short stories and see if you like
yeah.
the style.
There's a an annual that comes around that comes out yeah, annually once a year. I think it comes out once a year. You can correct me because you were in the first issue. Thrilling Adventure Yarns.
Oh, that's Crazy Eight Press. That's
Right.
spearheaded by Bob Greenberger. Yep.
Bob Greenberger. Yeah. But there's one that you can pick up and it has maybe a
Oh,
western, a sci-fi, a crime, something like that. So you can get
yeah.
a kind of smattering.
My wife and I actually did
I just read that one.
a romance
Yeah.
story,
Yeah.
sort of in the vein of kind of Dark Shadows. She was a huge Dark Shadows fan, so
Yeah.
we
Oh.
wanted to do something like you would have found in sort of in the a little bit of a darker. You know what? It was more of a gothic.
It was the picture.
Yeah. Girl
Girl in the
running from
picture.
house.
Girl running from house. Yeah, I
Yeah,
just read
which
it.
which is a cliche about Gothic. All the Gothic paperbacks had to have a girl
Right,
in a nightgown at night running away
right from the
with
house,
a big old creepy house in the
house in the
background.
background.
And
Yeah,
that's
yeah, yeah.
become known today as girl running from house because
Yep.
it's the cliche or the trope, whatever you want.
Right, right. But your and Becky's story was really entertaining.
Thank you.
Sounds very cool.
I appreciate that.
Very cool.
That was the last thing that she completed before she was gone, and we
Wow.
actually got the comp copies, wow, about a week or so before she was gone. So she got to she got to see it, in print, and we were very,
Mm.
very proud of that. And that story is way more her than it is me. It's something she really
I
wanted to.
was wondering that because I've read a
Yeah,
bunch of your stuff,
she
and
really
this had
spearheaded
a
it.
little flavor. Yeah,
Yeah, she
which is
really,
really
really
cool.
took the lead
That's
on that
cool.
one. And
But
it was nice to be able to have that genre in represented in that
yeah,
book.
Mm.
Yeah. But
and
you are absolutely correct. Those anthologies are perfect because you get all the genres in those.
yeah, yeah. So that's something if you're thinking about it, ladies and gentlemen, we've named a bunch. Rewind if you missed it. Um, but those you can get anywhere you get books these days, anywhere you order books, you
Yeah,
probably can grab at least one or two of them.
yeah.
Um,
And you know what you can do is look for author fairs in your area.
mhm,
They're all over the place. Or even go to a comic book convention. More and more guys like me are setting up at comic book shows.
yeah,
And then like I said, author fairs or library shows or things like
right,
that. And you're going to see, publishers who are not Simon and Schuster or Penguin or, and
right.
things like that. You're going to see, a little bit more blood, sweat, and tears in what's being put out.
I also see that as a little more um, approachably human because they
Yeah.
tend to have someone with hands on the projects
Mm.
behind the table talking to you about it. And
Mhm.
I really find that's great. It also allows me a weaker segue into a question for you. What would you think the status of today's market for pulp is?
Uh, from where I'm sitting, it's pretty good. I mean, if you really stepped way back, it's just, it's a little niche.
Right, but
But I'm amazed at how much is out there now. When I started, it was, basically two companies mainly, maybe
right,
three, and that was Prose and Airship
ship, right.
27. And interestingly enough, if you go to all of the guys now that have their little publishing houses, like me, I will bet you that at one point, somewhere along the line, they worked for those guys
Yeah, yeah.
and they caught the bug
Oh
and
yeah,
they said, you know what? That's all fine and dandy, and I'm glad to be getting this experience. But now I want to try to do it myself, do
right.
the whole package myself. I want to hire the artist and I want to bring, and it's the equivalent of kids on the street saying, let's put on a show.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
got a barn.
You
Right.
Well, kids today
that
will
so in that
record
sense,
albums or movies on their phone, God
Yeah.
bless them.
in that sense, it's pretty good, but it's
Yeah,
also pretty bad because that means I have that much more competition.
true, true.
But you know what? That means we all have to up our game then too,
That's true too.
Which is always healthy.
Yeah.
You have a couple more questions, Chris?
No, I was just about to toss it over to you to see if we're going to wrap or if there's something I missed or
I know that especially for those who are hungry for more information about the pulp world, that they could listen to another hour of this or so, and we will probably do that. But I think the one thing I would say, if there's anything, is wrapping this up by we talked about old pulp and we talked about contemporary pulp, new pulp, however you want to phrase that. And I think it's sort of like, can you sort of put a capper on it now, as if you were doing a log line for a film, or the description on the back of a book? What would you say pulp is now that would get writers to go, "Ooh, let me take a shot at that. Let me try and write that." Or, "Wow, that's what I've been writing. I'm excited to get it going." What would you say? How would you describe it, or what would you call it?
It's it's the style for ADD writers. It is it's a way to live an adventure through writing.
yeah,
I don't know if I can put it more plainly than that. It's it can be a thrill to put together. It can be a way to live those adventures vicariously by creating a character who maybe can do the things that you know can't do. And it is probably one of the most expansive ways to write also, in terms of there's no limitations, in my opinion, of what it can be adapted to.
Okay.
You know, let's say you
Oh, sorry.
say, I have a really great horror idea, you know, but I don't want to write a phone book size. I don't want to write a Stephen King horror novel. I want to write something quicker. You know, I have this really great concept. Well, you know what? Maybe look into the style of pulp. You know, maybe that's what it takes. And then find some of those classic horror or shudder pulps, as they used to call them back in the 30s and 40s. You know, it was the ones that got the publishers in trouble because of how lurid the covers were.
Right.
Right. Right.
You know,
Shutter.
it was, you know, Mayor, I'm trying to think of one of the mayors of New York City went on a crusade to get rid of,
LaGuardia?
uh, yeah, I think it was LaGuardia. I was going to say Figurello,
Yeah.
but maybe it was LaGuardia. Or what was his
Figueroa,
full name?
Figueroa LaGuardia.
It was Figurello. Okay, good.
Yeah.
That's who it was. I
That was
was
his
I'm
first
sorry, wait a
name.
minute. What
I was
did I
separating
do?
those into two people, but you know, but that's what I said. It's a style that you can embrace and will embrace you back. You know, it for me it's a home. No matter what I do, it's always going to be my touchstone and my launching pad. You know,
Okay.
even if I get a little fancy now and then, what I'm writing right at the moment has gotten a little fancy, but when you strip all those things away, I'm telling a story.
Yeah.
You're in love with it. I got you. I got Chris, how would you coin it?
Well, I think sometimes a writer is a pulp writer, no matter what he's trying or she's trying or they're trying to do. You know, I've gone through supernatural crime period in my writing, and then I've gone through this little horror uh, um, phase. But it's both of them still. When I look back at them, they feel a little pulpy, you know. And I think that's what you pour in is what comes out. So um, I think stories that are stripped down, that move, that you get the character development as they're running down the block, as opposed to stopping and having a cup of tea.
Right.
You know,
So
Yeah.
that
it's
kind of
action
stuff.
based. It's action based or
It
it's
driven,
moved. It's
you know,
moving.
Very,
story
yeah, it
driven,
has
right?
to
Yeah,
Story
move.
driven and plot driven.
yeah.
Right. Okay.
But it could still have big ideas, right?
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah.
Most of it does, right?
Mhm.
And but it's not two lovelorn characters looking across the field contemplating their navels. That we don't
No,
have time for that in
we don't,
this kind
yeah,
of writing,
yeah, we
right?
don't have time for that. Yeah,
Yeah.
So
yeah,
get in and get
It always
out.
feels like a clock is ticking, right?
yeah,
Right. There you go. Okay.
yeah.
Yeah.
See, folks,
The
I was trying to pare it down so that you could have a tasty concept to take away and really feel more energized about jumping into it. I don't want you to
Well,
think much
ladies and
about it, right?
gentlemen, if you want to really get a feel for it, I think you should go and wherever you buy books, type in Jim Beard, buy a few of his, type in Alex Simmons's Blackjack, buy a few of those. Then you can buy some Soul Scream Anthologine, and you can get a feel for that.
Yeah, there you go.
Maybe some Mallory and Gunner.
There you go. There you go. There you go. Good
and
way to
and
go. Okay.
Six Gun Legends.
Yeah.
Six Gun Legends, baby. I'll tell you, I'm ridiculously proud of being included in that book. Included.
But how much more westerns have you written? How many more?
Well, you know what? It's so funny. A friend of mine from the neighborhood, he was actually a little older than me, but he lives in California, but keeps in touch. He loves reading. So he heard about this and he bought Six Gun Legends and he loved it, right? And he was very complimentary about mine because, we're all neighborhood guys.
Yeah.
But um, he points me towards the Outlaws' first album,
Hmm.
right? of all things, the Outlaw's first album. And he says, there's at least 6 or 7 Western stories in here, you know? And I said, well, I've been thinking of those characters and what else I might want to do with them. I will take a listen to that album. Now, I'm a couple of projects away. I got to do this damn Sherlock Holmes thing. But once we get through that, I'll be listening to, I always have a playlist, but it'll be that Outlaws album as I'm thinking of those characters again and, where I want to go.
Okay.
Well, Outlaw more, gotta ride again.
As a publisher, my greatest reward would be to know that all the writers in that book continued those characters.
Yeah.
Not everyone was created for that for that volume, but the ones that were, I sincerely hope that not necessarily at Flinch, but that they gain more life past that anthology.
So once
There's
again,
something else with the
what's the title of that book?
Six Gun Legends.
Thank you. Okay.
Yeah.
From
Great book,
what
great book.
publisher?
Flinch Books.
Okay,
and like that.
And on that note, Jim, thank you for joining us.
Thank
come
you.
Back. As a matter of fact, you're going to come back at some point to talk about what, Chris?
Procrastination. And I'll tell you what, fellas, I don't think we're going to be putting it off too much.
Right, there you go.
I'm thinking about it, and if I feel like it,
Yeah, right.
We'll get to it.
Yeah. But Jim will be back. Jim will definitely be back again. So thank you, Jim, for joining us. Chris, yay. Once again, we're back. We're back.
Thank you, Alex. Glad to be back for the next 350 episodes.
Take care, everybody.
Peace, everybody. Thanks for being here. Peace. Thanks, Jim.